Professor Tolkien said in his letters, that's sometimes the most compelling story is the untold story. We can't do anything to those books. Those books are going to stand as these masterpieces, hopefully till the end of time. We can't ruin them. So it's nothing woke about this, guys, if you're out there.
What did you say?
It started, of course, with J.R.R. Tolkien's epic fantasy book series. Adaptations followed over the years, first on radio, then in animation, before Peter Jackson finally brought the realm of Middle-earth to a worldwide audience with his acclaimed Lord of the Rings trilogy. Since then, adaptations have continued, with the newest take being an anime-style film that peers into the previously untold chapter of Tolkien's world, the War of the Rohirrim. Coming from the Jackson Trilogy co-writer Philippa Boyens and Studio New Line, The War of the Rohirrim dives into Tolkien's appendices to fill in some of the gaps of Middle-earth history, but it's also very clearly set in the Peter Jackson version of Tolkien's fantasy world.
Arise!
We talked to Boyens and producer Jason DeMarco about how they cracked the code on telling a brand new Lord of the Rings story while managing to stay true to not just Tolkien, but Peter Jackson as well.
You think I am afraid of you?
You should be.
The War of the Rohirrim is the latest project based on Tolkien's beloved fantasy series that attempts to fill in an aspect of Middle-earth history that the author only barely touched upon in his original works. In this case, the history of Rohan's rulers from the appendices of The Lord of the Rings was the starting point, specifically Helm Hammerhand, voiced by Brian Cox in the film. Of course, Helm will become the inspiration for what we know as Helm's Deep.
Horn of Helm Hammerhand shall sound in the deep one last time.
Philippa Boyens not only co-wrote the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies, but also his Hobbit trilogy with the director and Fran Walsh. She also co-wrote the story for War of the Rohirrim. As she explains, figuring out what tale to tell with an animated film initially stumped her and the team.
There's many stories out there within the appendices, within the world. The story's still untold within the books. All of that. It was just not, somehow it wasn't gelling.
It was producer Jason DeMarco who suggested pivoting to taking an anime-style approach.
For me, the biggest challenge was how are we going to bring forward Tolkien in a way that no one has seen before, which is as anime, make it feel true to Tolkien and the films that Philippa and Peter and Fran did, and then also make it feel like a true anime. It was a real delicate balancing act.
As soon as they said anime, this story popped into my brain, and that's when I started thinking, you know what, we could do this. This could work.
You know nothing of war.
I pledge to fight for my king.
After pitching the idea to Warner Brothers, the next task was to get director Kenji Kamiyama to sign on. Boyens and DeMarco wanted to make sure they could hook the Blade Runner Black Lotus and Ghost in the Shell standalone complex director in, and they felt they had an idea he wouldn't pass up.
It's an interesting piece of storytelling, even if you just follow the bare threads that are in the book. And that's because it starts out huge and quite epic. In fact, the biggest battle we have, the attack on Edoras, is at the end of the first act.
Riders of the Mark, brothers of Rohan.
And for a lot of directors, I think that would scare them. Like, because you land in this huge epic moment, and it is really shocking to see Edoras in flames. But then the film changes, and it's really interesting the way it changes into this intense kind of siege.
Despite the fact that The War of the Rohirrim is an animated film, or that it takes place some 180 years before the Lord of the Rings trilogy, there's no denying that it still feels like the world we all know and love from the Peter Jackson films. Of course, it's a story set in Tolkien's Middle-earth, but the depiction of any book series is always open to interpretation from a visual perspective. That said, War of the Rohirrim shares a design aesthetic from the Jackson films, and that was very much intentional, starting with director Kenji Kamiyama.
Well, our director was pretty clear from the beginning that he wanted this film to firmly sit within the universe established by Phil and Peter and Fran.
Edoras and the Golden Hall of Meadowstone.
So one of the first things we did was reach out to Weta and say, do you have CG models of the Hornburg, which they did, that were 20 years old. They also had tons and tons of delightful physical maquettes and stuff.
Weta, of course, is the effects company that worked on Jackson's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies, and they were a major force in creating the Middle-earth that most people think about these days. In addition to the CG models and maquettes, they were also able to provide the War of the Rohirrim team with a ton of photographs and drawings that the film's background artists and designers could use for reference.
It takes me straight back to the memory of being on the set.
But amusingly, the huge resource of the Weta archives also led to the occasional problem.
You know, we actually ran into the kinds of things you only run into when you get into the nitty-gritty on things like this, where Kamiyama was trying to block out scenes and going, well, where does this room sit inside the Hornburg? And then we heard back like, oh, geographically, the inside's bigger than the outside. It doesn't really make sense. Just work it out however you want to. So there were things like that happened that you would never have guessed because you're making a movie 20 years earlier and you're not thinking anyone's ever going to revisit this location.
No army has ever breached the Deeping Wall or set foot inside the Hornburg.
Another challenge for the War of the Rohirrim artists was to take the 3D design of the Jackson films and transform them into a 2D painterly style of anime. In fact, Weta was brought in to help design new elements that might not have been in the Jackson films, just to make sure that they felt like they fit into the overall world.
We knew we're coming at people with a totally different style than they've seen with Lord of the Rings, but yet we wanted them to feel like they were home. And to us, that was one way we could help achieve that without sort of having to clonk people over the head.
Ultimately, the artists also had to take into account not just the where of the story, but also the when.
Yeah, I mean, the Hornburg is an ancient fortress, obviously, but we did think about things like, what did it look like 200 years before you see it in the Two Towers? Was there anything different? What would we change? You know, how do we make it a little less ancient, but still ancient? You know, stuff like that.
Boyens noticed some familiar traits and talents when working with director Kamiyama.
He brought much bigger scale to it. So anything I thought of, he would take that and expand it even more, like the long winter and what that means, you know, visually. And then he would he would immediately contrast it magnificently in a way where I would never have thought of that. My brain was still, okay, we're in this cold, dark, and then suddenly sun is coming through on this frozen scene. You know, this is why you work with a visual master. But he also reminded me of Peter because he's a storyteller, you know, first and foremost, and he's always looking for what is filmic, what is the moment here that is going to imprint itself on your mind visually. And so I love working with people like that because he would throw ideas out there and then we would try and think, how are we going to earn this?
Yeah.
How are we going to earn this? That's so cool. I want to earn this.
There is something you can do. You can choose. You can choose how this ends.
The narration of the film is by Miranda Otto, who of course played Eowyn, a shield maiden of the Rohan in the Jackson films.
You do not command the others to stay. They fight beside you because they would not be parted from you. Because they love you.
She tells the viewer from the outset that even the inhabitants of Middle-earth don't know this particular story, which is an interesting way for the writers of War of the Rohirrim to head off any criticism at the past that may come from fans complaining that this is a new story.
Professor Tolkien said in his letters, that's sometimes the most compelling story is the untold story.
We could tell a story within that didn't change anything that Tolkien put down, but still fleshed it out to be what it needed to be, which is a feature film. So I think it was that and a callback to Eowyn and a cool way to say, like, there are legends of many strong people, strong women who have done these things who may not be written in the histories, but that doesn't mean they weren't exciting stories.
I am no man.
The unsung hero of this story is actually Helm's daughter, who is voiced by Gaia Wise. Unnamed in Tolkien's work, Boyens and the other writers decided to call her Hera. So when Otto's narration says to not go looking for tales of Hera in the old songs, it's because there literally are none.
Women of this country learned long ago. Those without swords can still die upon them. I fear neither death nor pain.
That was deliberately saying to the audience, we know what we're doing here. We know, we understand that. Stay with us.
What do you fear, my lady?
A cage.
Because what I think you see will unfold, hopefully, because this is where we work from and where you guys work from, because this guy's a big Tolkien nerd as well, is that don't just change something arbitrarily. If we're going to change something, do it for good storytelling reasons, and then anything you bring to it, make it feel real, make it feel authentic.
You may wear a crown upon your head, but that does not make you a king.
Boyens says that the story also could have been about Hera's father Helm, or perhaps even Wolf, the antagonist of the story. But she and the writers wanted to be able to end the film on a more hopeful note than those other characters would have taken things.
I think always Tolkien brings that element of hope to his storytelling.
There is always hope.
What was interesting about her is if you actually examine the story on the page, so much of it starts with her in a way.
The filmmakers also thought that including a character from the original Jackson films was important, and Eowyn was the perfect choice to tell the tale of Hera.
My uncle told me a strange thing. He said that you rode to war with Thengel, my grandfather.
Luckily, we sent it to Miranda, and I think I remember emailing you going, she said yes. And actually, can I tell you, the thing that she particularly loved was that line, do not go looking for her in the old songs. You know, tales of her in the old songs, there are none. She loved that. I think she liked that challenge. We always said to imagine that you're telling this tale to your young son in Gondor of your ancestor.
As we saw with the release of the Rings of Power Amazon Prime series, which is also based on Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, there is an element of fandom who can come out hard against a franchise if they don't like the way the certain elements, characters, or what have you are being portrayed. Call it toxic fandom, call it a vocal minority, or just ignore it completely. There's no denying that the internet has become a megaphone for such voices in a way that wasn't the case when the original Peter Jackson trilogy was released.
The light's passed on. Way towards the north. Something's drawn its gaze.
We asked the filmmakers if they felt like they needed to take this into consideration when making War of the Rohirrim.
No, you can't. I don't think you can. You know, it's like Tolkien didn't just write books. He wrote an entire mythology, a vast, incredible work, which is so detailed and so complex and works on so many different layers. And you can just leave that alone and not touch it. But he himself did not want that, and he himself said that. He wanted other minds to come to it.
You finished it. Not quite. There's room for a little more.
Bringing music and art and drama to it. So he had a sense of that at some stage, because what he knew about myth is it cannot be immutable.
As Boyens says, the books aren't going anywhere regardless of how many spin-offs or new adaptations are made in whatever medium.
We can't do anything to those books. Those books are going to stand as these masterpieces, hopefully till the end of time. We can't ruin them. So people who come at you saying, oh, you ruined this or you ruined that, no, all we did was we presented you with an adaptation of this work. And some people will come to it and relate to it, and some people won't. And sometimes the criticism is justified, and sometimes it doesn't.
With that philosophy also comes strict guidelines in terms of if, how, and when to change anything from pre-established works. Don't change things lightly, and don't do it for no reason. There has to be a reason.
Make sure that you know what that reason is, and it's a really good storytelling reason why you're having to make that change. If you're adding, make it as authentic as you can possibly make it. So we didn't just draw upon Eowyn for Hera. We drew upon women from early English history, that Tolkien himself would have been familiar with. So it's nothing woke about this, guys, if you're out there.
How did it come to this?
Ha! For even more Lord of the Rings and all its many forms, be sure to like and subscribe to IGN wherever you like to watch.